The following presentation was given at the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Tupelo in Tupelo, Mississippi. All are welcome to join us on Sundays at 11 a.m. at 1301 Marshall Street in Tupelo.
So, movies. People have strong feelings about movies. Some people are very, very into movies, and others are actually pretty indignantly somehow happy to report how few they've ever seen and how expensive they are and crowded and how much they don't like them. But I was blessed to grow up in a family where movies were a big part of our life, and I'm going to mix up my movie sermon a little bit with a Father's Day tribute and say that I was blessed to have a grandfather and a father who both appreciated what movies can offer us. So when I was a really little girl, I lived part of the time with my extended family up in Nettleton, Mississippi, over by Tupelo, over right here. It's about 15 miles away, I think, small little town. Much more exciting town then than it is now, and it had a movie theater. And they showed movies every Friday night and every Saturday during the day. So I had mixed feelings about movies, and I had always a poor attention span. So my poor, long-suffering grandfather, who was, I think, probably a saint, essentially, even though we weren't Catholic, he would pay to take me into the movies, and then I would sit there, and if I was bored, I would just demand to leave. Okay, and then sometimes I would decide, well, actually, I needed to know how it turned out, so I would demand that we go back. And they would make him pay again, and he would do it, because he was that kind of indulgent grandfather. So I saw the beginning and the ending of a lot of early movies and didn't really see the in-between part. So to this day, movies will come on one of the Turner Classic Movies channels or one of the other old movie channels, and I'll finally see the middle of some childhood movie. Some of the ones I remember are the Tarzan movies. And I remember loving those movies. Was Johnny Weissmuller there've been many Tarzans, but he was the one of the Tarzans of my childhood. And of course, like many children, I of course wanted to do and be all the things that I saw in the movies. So I, who really did not like animals that well and was totally unsuited to living in the outdoors, of course I wanted to be Jane and moved to a jungle and raise a cheetah. And if any of you remember those movies, they had a son who didn't really have a name. He was just called Boy, which is interesting. So didn't really have a separate identity. But those movies changed my life. I saw some of the early and very crude science fiction movies with weird little robots, and I saw a few of the early kind of Disney cartoons, of course. Then, as I got older, my father, who had some pretty unique ideas about raising children and about life in general, when I was about 12, 13, is when the movies that are still occasionally show today on some of those old movie channels starring Rock Hudson and Doris Day, what at that point seemed like hardcore pornography, because we were barely talking about the fact that sex even existed in that era, the 50s and early 60s. We saw movies like Pillow Talk and Touch of Mink and so forth that starred the very wholesome-looking Doris Day. And many of the parents in my generation would not let their kids go to such movies, but because my parents were so forward-thinking and permissive, we ended up often seeing those same movies again with 10 kids in the car, my friends who knew that if they went with the family, they wouldn't have to explain themselves. We would go into the drive-in with a bunch of people in the car and see some of those same movies together. So basically, my parents were responsible for corrupting pretty much a whole generation of kids around the towns that I grew up in. But I didn't see it as corrupting. I see it as enhancing and enlivening to see movies and people living out lives, as one of our readings said, that is not your own. Seeing movies gave me ideas, gave me role models, gave me senses of what was possible. And when I got to older and was living on my own at 17, 18 in Washington, D.C. as a young adult, in college, I discovered foreign films. Now, to this day, I hear a lot of people say, I just can't watch subtitles. Well, of course you can. Like any other habit, it's something you can learn to do. And so to me, to deprive yourself of the richness and storytelling and magnificent views of international cinema is a real sad thing. These movies can help you understand the world we live in. I watched the movies of Federico Fellini, the great Italian filmmaker, and saw the one called 8½, where we get introduced to all sorts of unusual characters in the Italy, Rome of that period. His movies were all very visually interesting and kind of disquieting. The Swedish filmmaker Ingmar Bergman was making movies in that era that raised interesting issues about life and death and the meaning of life, and more meaningful to me than any of the little philosophy courses that I was taking in school. And those movies, the images from those movies haunt me still. There are all kinds of great movies being made now by other countries. Iranian film, here we are talking about possibly going to war with Iran. Well, anybody that has seen the incredibly brilliant filmmaking coming out of Iran would totally understand this is not the kind of country that we want to go in and decimate. Their government has some severe problems, but as a people coming out of the ancient Persian culture, they have incredible literary and philosophical things going on over there, and the film makes that very clear. And you see from the movies coming out of Iran that the people are dying for liberation, and we just need to give them time to do it on their own. We do not need to go in and bomb the hell out of Tehran or some other their other beautiful cities. That culture is one that will eventually emerge again on its own. And movies have made that very clear and obvious to me. A lot of interesting movies coming out of mainland China. And from watching those movies, we can learn things about how much more like us people in that culture are than most of us could imagine from what we hear from news and just general circumstances. So to me, the movies have always been about making us more multicultural and more engaged. But there are movies that come out of they have a lot more to say. And so one of the books that I read in thinking about this topic is a book called Cinema Nirvana, written by a gentleman named Dean Slider, who was kind of a practicing Buddhist. And he talks about his odd experience when he began to realize that the smell from popcorn in movie theaters is oddly like the smell of the tallow candles that burn in Buddhist temples in Tibet. And he has this to say. He says, what I smelled in Tibet were butter lamps, simple cups of yak butter with lighted wicks carried by wide-eyed peasants as they walked in silence from one shrine room to the next. Like movie theaters, the temples are windowless and dark. The butter lamps burning there for centuries have coated everything with a fine layer of sooty grease, so that the stone floors, like the floors of movie theaters, are sticky underfoot. So who would find a parallel between Buddhist temples and the theater? But if you think about it, there's a lot to be said, because movies can reach people that books can't. How many more people saw the recently ended television show Game of Thrones than read those books, which are each about 1,000 pages long? I mean, I've read some of the books, and I even have been having trouble getting through the ones that are already written. But so many people watch that series with an almost religious fanaticism. And I put it off for years. I'm always kind of snobbish about things, and anything that's too popular, I'm always thinking, well, perhaps that's just not for me. But I started watching it, and yes, there's a lot of gratuitous violence, there's a lot of nudity, there's a lot of sex and so on, but it's also a great story of political intrigue, religions competing with each other, people who think they are prophets who turn out to be false prophets, and most of all, there are heroes and anti-heroes and heroines, and help comes from surprising sources. So it turns out that it is another manifestation of what I call the great story of what it means to be human and to contend and to have problems. So another movie that I'm going to talk a little bit about that might be surprising is the very first animated film ever made and the first blockbuster in that genre, which was Disney's Snow White. Now, there's a lot to be said about some of the dumbing down Disney has done to some of the great fairy tales of our time, and of the ancient tales from Grimm and so on. He's made everything so cute. You know, we have little dancing teapots and Beauty and the Beast, which is really a pretty scary story, even though the Beast is a little unattractive in the cartoon version. He makes it all seem just a little too warm and cozy. And that's been something he's done to many of those tales. But the original Snow White, that wasn't quite the case. But in that movie, even though the sort of basic traditional reading of Snow White was that she was the quintessential passive female, a little princess who was just waiting for the prince to come along and waken her with a kiss so that she can go on to have an adult life, that movie, as it's made, has a lot more going on. Now, the original story from Grimm had the seven dwarves in it. Well, it didn't even give a number, and it certainly didn't give them names and personalities. But if you think about the movie, which how many of you have seen Snow White in a time that you could even vaguely remember it? Well, if you haven't ever seen it, it is a classic, so you should go back and look at it with in mind what I'm going to tell you. So the dwarves in the movie version become personifications of us. You know, you have Dopey and Grumpy. You have Doc, who's kind of the intellectual part of our brains, the rational part. Little Dopey's kind of just, he's kind of blissed out, you know, kind of the epitome of somebody who's kind of in a naive form of Nirvana. And you have the others make up the moods that we all have. So in many ways, the dwarves can be seen as different parts of everybody's personality. And Snow White is kind of the epitome of everybody's early naivete. How as children, as we depend on our parents or grandparents or caretakers, we trust that they're somehow not going to do any harm to us. And Snow White is the epitome of an abused child. She is someone who has that horrible stepmother who is terrible to her and actually tries to kill her. But in her original state, Snow White kind of epitomizes youthful naivete and hopefulness. She's so sure that she's going to find the one. And you know, one of the great songs from the movie, of course, is "Someday My Prince Will Come." And again, the prince doesn't necessarily mean just the male figure that she hopes to fall in love with and marry, but also the rescuer of all time, the person that's going to rescue from her isolation and take her into a new life. So that film, which seems simple, there's a reason why it was one of the all-time top movies, and that it's still rented and shown in its original state, because it tells us a lot about the human personality, these different moods that we go through in the dwarves, our eternal hope in the persona of a somewhat naive person like Snow White, and that also tells us the very crucial thing we need to know to become adults, which is that evil exists. Not everybody wishes us well. And cartoons and animated films, while varying a lot in quality, have continued to teach us these kinds of lessons. The ones I mentioned, How to Train Your Dragon and Secret Life of Pets, continue to show us the heroes and heroines. And the last scene in Snow White, the castle that she's going to with her prince, now that he's awakened her and they're going off together, it's sort of floating. It's kind of clear that it's not just a castle of this world. It kind of epitomizes something more. It's something to aspire to. It's a lofty destiny that we can think of as a place where we're going to go, not to be heaven exactly, but some sort of place of a higher realm of being. Okay, so you can accuse me and the people who wrote the books that I've read about movies of being kind of over-reading and deep-reading and trying hard to find things. But if you think about it, these kinds of movies do have an impact on us. And if we were exposed to these movies as kids, then we grow on, hopefully, to enjoy more adult versions. But it's always some of these same stories. There is always the good and evil, the person who is kind of the rescuer, the person who needs to be rescued, and that can vary from story to story. But if you think about it, it's sort of always there. And that's why I think fantasy films and things like Game of Thrones that are fully fleshed out and not animated, those are the same stories. Yes, they dwell in kind of that never land, but they're really about how things are in the real world. Another genre of film that I haven't really ever talked about before, I've given, as you might suspect, several different sermons on movies over my long career in ministry, and they're always different because I keep seeing different movies, or I keep going back and seeing old movies again with new eyes. My cousin, who lives in Oxford and who's the professor of journalism, is a fan of film noir. Now, how many of you do you know if you like film? They're always dark and usually black and white, and there's always a femme fatale and a hard-bitten detective. So those are also fascinating stories because they dwell in that netherworld where we see that just beneath the surface of the white picket fence and the nice neighborhoods and the fancy houses that people build on the sites of old houses, in every small town even, there's another kind of hidden world. Most of the film noir takes place in cities, but my cousin wrote a book called Casey's Last Chance that's in film noir that's set largely on the back roads of Mississippi. His hero in that particular movie goes to Memphis for some of his cases, and he ends up driving around on these dark, endless Mississippi highways at night, which is a perfect setting for a noir film. And usually the hero of such film is something like maybe just a random guy, not necessarily a great hero. A lot of them were played by Humphrey Bogart and John Garfield. And they're an ambiguous kind of hero because they're not necessarily great role models. Usually they drink too much. They often have a couple of mistresses floating around. They're not people that we see as paradigms of the community, but always in the dark world that they're inhabiting, which is often a world of sort of an underworld, gangs and drugs and things being stolen and maybe nefarious politics and so on. They become the voice of reason, the voice of the consciousness. They become a kind of new kind of hero. And the femme fatales often turn out to be prostitutes with hearts of gold, different things, a daughter of a wealthy family who turns out to be the only one that kind of sees through what her nefarious relatives are doing. The Big Sleep is a classic noir film, but there are dozens of them. And Turner Classic Movies plays those noir movies all the time, and they're very addicting. A lot of them were B movies with the junior varsity movie stars in them, although Humphrey Bogart, as I said, starred in many of them. If you've never watched any of those things, they're very fascinating because it forces you to identify with a somewhat questionable character, or characters usually, but in contrast to the often high-level people who are corrupt, and Lord knows we're dealing in our world now with a lot of high-level corrupt people, we could use a few characters, like the kind of characters that Bogart and Garfield played, of hard-bitten guys who see through it all and try to get people to do the right thing and rescue some of the people that are victimized. So in many ways, we're kind of living right now in our culture in a film noir world. I'm going to use some old movies, but there are many wonderful movies being made right now. Just one that I adored was Rocket Man. Anybody seen Rocket Man yet? The Elton John. It's not necessarily a biopic. It's sort of about his life, but it's a fantasy. But it's a redemption fantasy. It's a fantasy that all of us need to be able to partake in, of someone who had a sad early life, fell into too much success too soon, and almost died of the wretched excess of that, based on a kind of a core being that was so insecure and had a feeling of being unloved. And then, of course, it turns into a redemption story in which we find that he begins to find ways to help heal himself, and that there's sort of a happy ending insofar as anybody's life has a happy ending. None of us get out of here alive, but we can have some wonderful and amazing adventures along the way. And certainly attending movies, learning from movies, taking them seriously, talking about them, sharing our reactions to them. How many conversations have you been in when one of the questions, along with, how are the kids doing, or how's your significant other doing, is, you seen any good movies lately? Now, more and more that may mean, have you seen them on your home screen? But it may also mean, what have you seen at the movie theater? Now, I want to say a little word in defense of the actual theaters. I understand that you can buy a huge screen in your house now and have Dolby sound put in and all that, but it's either you or you and your family or you and a few friends, a self-selected group. But there's nothing like seeing an interesting new movie with a random audience. And there's also nothing like going into an empty movie theater all by yourself. And the lights go down, you see some previews, you see some little advertisements, and then the movie comes on. And then you are transported. And you may have a religious experience that you were not expecting. You never know what's going to happen. What will happen next on the screen? Who will you identify with? Who will you want to be? Where will it take you, and where will you want to go because of it? So Dean ends his wonderful book, ends his introduction to his wonderful book, Cinema Nirvana, saying this. He says, let's pick a seat, 6th row, right aisle for me, please. Put up our feet and soak up some enlightenment lessons. And don't forget the popcorn. As it happens, our ritual movie-going snack is an enlightenment lesson in itself. And I just love this. The product of a dramatic transformation. Something small, hard, and unpalpable explodes and turns inside out, becoming tender and tasty as it expands. This is just the kind of transformation we want our own lives to undergo. To explode out of hard constrictedness, to blow open our own kernel of truth, to bring to the outside the tender, tasty enlightenment that was already inside. Let's see what we can learn about this process from the movies. So, while I want you to come to our gatherings here, honestly, if I had to give you a prescription for growth and learning, I think the movies honestly might top most of the religious establishments I've attended in my life. And I spent many years of my life going to the movies on Sunday. And now that church is a regular part of my life, since I decided to go into it as a profession, when I was preaching full-time in Florida, I would do church. I would try to kick everybody out after our lengthy coffee hours, and they did go on because we had a patio that people could sit for hours in Florida. About 2:30, I would eventually shovel everybody out, lock the doors, and I would take off to my favorite little art theater and go to the movies. And that would become essentially my church for the day. So, yes, it's expensive, but there's nothing like going into that theater and having to turn your cell phone off, and no one can find you unless they know just where you are. And you have peace for 2 hours, and who knows what will happen to you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the UUC of Tupelo's podcast. You can find us at uuctupeloms.org, on Facebook by searching for UUC Tupelo, or contact us by email at uuctupelocom@gmail.com. That's uuctupelocom@gmail.com. The UUC of Tupelo is a welcoming congregation who accept all people, regardless of creed, color, national origin, gender, or gender identity. We hope you have enjoyed this podcast, and as you head on your way, go in peace, believe in peace, create peace.